When I came to America, it happened in 1981, I came as a refugee from what used to be Soviet Union. I was often asked, do you miss it? And I would say either no, but it's not what you mean, or yes, but it's not what you mean.
All of us immigrants from totalitarian Russia, Soviet Russia, to United States, we're always in transition, because you never will be 100% Americans, and you never will back to Soviet Union. Such a state not exist anymore. It's about transitions, permanent transitions, frozen moment of eternity.
She did certainly write about exile, diaspora, taking the point of view of people, groups, writers, and so forth who were on the margins, let's say outsiders.
Her originality really lay in her freshness of mind and in her ability to play off her personal experience, her close attention to texts, to film, to art, and then her knowledge and understanding, her deep understanding of literary and cultural theory.
She finds her kind of parallel way of making an argument that doesn't make it easy to place her or to slot her into any kind of scholarly group, but creates a movement, you know, a Svetlanian movement, a way of addressing reality in a manner that is completely and entirely her own.
Legacy, I don't know. I mean, she clearly, she was my friend, and I knew she was an important academic. I didn't think of her as an important academic. Sometimes I encounter somebody for whom she's a name in academia, and apparently her scholarship has left a huge impact, and it breaks my heart that I didn't get enough from her. I mean, we were friends for 20 years, but there's so much that we didn't talk about, and the books that I'm writing now could have benefited so much from her, and I wish I could ask her questions about her books, which I didn't read carefully enough when she was alive. So it's really hard to talk about her legacy. Her legacy at this point is to me, her absence.
She was trying to pass me for a nice Soviet girl. I could never behave right. I would always open the doll's heads and see what's there. For me, and maybe it's a Soviet symptom, maybe not, in a way this dissent and panic were very closely together. Mm-hmm. And I think it's still true about me. That in a way it's kind of fight or flight. I don't conform, but it doesn't mean I'm brave. It's that my reaction is this kind of escape, dissent, which is a combination of fear, or maybe feeling little not belonging or having to tell the truth, I don't know. But somehow there's a lot packed in this story for me. I was a very good student. I played the game, but I knew it was not my game. I was not exposed to any dissidents, any dissident writers. I mean, the best I did was watching Antonioni movies and talking to my grandmother about Gulag. And she shared stories with me which were way beyond my age.
My mother likes Svetlana very much, and she helped grow up Svetlana.
Sofia was a sister of my grandfather. My grandfather, Yefim, emigrate to France in the late 1929. She was sent later after the war to the Gulag because she was, of course, the sister of enemies of Soviet Union. So she spent a few years in north of Russia. Svetlana was very proud of her grandmother.
One of her Gulag friends, Bella Ilinishna, talked to me that that's really, really important to become a young pioneer. We have to kind of get back to the real spirit of the revolution. Взвейтесь кострами белые, синие ночи, мы пионеры, дети рабочие. For a while I also wanted to be a good pioneer, but it just didn't feel right. I kind of already knew that somehow I don't belong to this official sociality, that there was something fake about it. I became kind of more of a real dissident in 5th grade.
Okay.
I didn't want to belong too much. I would be disgusted if my participation would be required. What I took seriously is almost like negative things, what you don't do, that you don't betray, don't backstab, don't inform. My principles was not to lie. Служил Гаврила Млади, Богу с ним, вот это intonation, молодым борцом Гаврила сын, убил Гаврила Фердинанда. My grandparents, all Jewish, nobody was communist or Zionist. You know, they were kind of like small merchants, or like, you know, they were like all downward mobility families. Like my grandfather, who was a decorator of shop windows in Leningrad, he comes from near Vitebsk, escaped Leningrad to join my grandmother in Siberia. They lived very poorly. My grandfather on the other side was an engineer who came from Riga, went to Warsaw, was in Leningrad siege. Moral narratives of moral compromise were framed by the war. Who betrays and who doesn't betray. So it's like the idea you have to know where to hide. And maybe this is how I was thinking my Jewishness.
I'd question the Jewish part because I wonder how much you really could have known at the time. You know, considering that it wasn't talked about in the Soviet Union, the Holocaust.
What Holocaust we didn't know, but we knew about Evtushenko. My great-grandmother was probably shot in Babi Yar. So perhaps I didn't know what Jewish meant, but I knew that Jewish was connected to a different history. I always thought my parents were very cool and I was close to them. They were not pressing me to be conformist, but they didn't expect I'll go as far.
My name is Muza Goldberg. I'm Svetlana's mother. In Soviet Union, I've been marine engineer, fish and vessels.
I'm Yuri Goldberg. I'm father of Svetlana Boym. In Soviet Union, I was mechanical engineer, and we created cinema club. Svetlana, when she became teenager, she coming, watch movie, but more important was discussion after movie. Talking not only about movie, but talking about life and everything what's going on around us. It's certainly should influence on Svetlana imagination, Svetlana life.
Our life was not fairy tale. We live in communal apartment and we have one very big room and another very, very small. In small room it was Yuri mother. When Svetlana was 7 years old, had her own room. She was very proud to have her room and some secret life.
I really loved it. Lying there with books, it was like my kingdom. Because I lived in a communal apartment, the movie club was close by, my parents actually left me alone since the age of 5. Or they dragged me to the film club.
Mm-hmm.
So
Which did you prefer?
I love being alone and I'm afraid to be left completely alone. And I think that's a bit of a story of my life. I was propelled forward and I was propelled out of myself, not inwards. There's something about Soviet culture of which I was a product that was not necessarily pushing you to explore your interiority. It was pushing you to explore your fantasy and imagination. I was completely lived in literature, so that it was no longer fairy tales, it was French novels, particularly Three Musketeers. I was always writing, I was writing these novels in the 5th grade. I kind of felt like I have some sort of vacation or calling. I think I actually was very interested in a little bit in philosophy, like I organized the club of subjective idealists in women's bathroom. And we had a lot of free time and we read a lot of poetry. My convictions were like coming from literature. That this is what was great about Soviet education. We really were reading great literary texts, which were giving us ambivalences, moral quest, sort of a different system of coordinates. I also started to read more Western literature, like existentialism, So there was like other universe. I also then remember in the physics class, the physics teacher suddenly said, of course we know that the universe is infinite and incalculable. When I heard that, I just froze. I kind of felt there is this big world out there to which I have almost no access. I wanted to believe something. I wanted to believe this kind of existential or Western values or quest for self-improvement. I really wanted to be still idealistic to some extent. So I wanted to almost study foreign culture, hoping to get something. Somewhere 8th, 9th grade, with all the Italian movies, with reading, I kind of embraced aestheticism as a kind of form of honest existence.
So what was your aestheticism?
Poetry,
What kind?
literature, Mandelstam, Akhmatova, symbolists. I read a lot in 9th grade, Ilya Ehrenburg, Люди годы жизни, about Paris, turn of the century, and I completely embraced it. The kind of Bohemia, Picasso, this kind of lifestyles. And since the age of 15, 16, going to the arts academy, and they were like these drunken parties. It was also showing me the other world. This Bohemia was like alternative culture, this kind of dark Leningrad irony. What attracted me is that they had this interesting adventurous lifestyles and they really had this artistic quest. I became like a tour guide, was studying French, beauty, literature, foreign art. This seemed to be real.
When she was 15 years old, she wrote, I agreed to work hard, work honest, but I'd like to be something in life.
I basically really wanted to do philosophy, psychology in Leningrad University, but I know it's a forbidden fruit. My father said there's no anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and then he was told that she would never get into University of Leningrad. And then they said the only place where they take Jews was this Педагогический институт, Испанское отделение.
I felt a sense of basically stagnation. I felt that my life was becoming so prescriptible.
What I wanted is to expand my world.
Hello, I'm Constantine Boym. I'm an architect, designer, writer, teacher, and I'm Svetlana's ex-husband. I was from Moscow. She was still a student at Pedagogical Institute of Languages in Leningrad. The only place for us possibly to meet was, of course, in Crimea, the Black Sea, where young people from all European Soviet Union came for their vacation. So we met in a line for beer. It was a first conversation, which determined many things right away. I told her that I was intending to immigrate from the Soviet Union. She told me that she always was looking for freedom and wanted to see the world.
You know, she had this whole mythology that she had very much promoted, and she entertained me with the story one of the first times we met. How she was in a queue in Crimea getting dried fish, and this guy standing behind her asked her if she wanted to move to America, and she said yes. I obviously, as with all myths and all memories, things were a lot more complicated than that.
Svetlana and Constantine married in December 1979.
The problem with visas took me 3 years. Either you were waiting for the arrest and exile to Siberia, or you were waiting for going abroad. It was a very risky enterprise. People had to leave their jobs, people lost their friends.
There was one verb in Russian, уезжать, to depart. One word, no questions asked. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s, to depart meant to immigrate, to go beyond the wall and never look back. You might as well be going to the moon or to the underworld. I decided to immigrate from the Soviet Union at the age of 20 in 1979 for political reasons. I was influenced by my grandmother's stories of Gulag camps and her dreams of escape, but mostly I just wanted to follow the long takes in the films of Michelangelo Antonioni that promised an unforeseen freedom of movement. However, my own journey to freedom resembled nothing I saw in the movies. We, the refugees, were not into remembering. At the Soviet border, we were stripped of citizenship and of our memories. Even our photo albums were censored. I think no more than 5 people on the photograph were allowed. First, there was, of course, Vienna, we were in a camp. We took a train, we went without ticket. We were like these poor, dirty refugees. And when I saw the streets of Venice, I just sat and cried. I cried from being totally overwhelmed that it's a carnival of life to which I don't belong. I kind of wanted to come to Boston because I thought it's like Leningrad. It's a historic European city. In America, I felt less like we are refugees.
She, like very many immigrants, wanted to play down her Russian identity when she came to the United States. Svetlana Goldberg was a very Russian Jewish name, and she really tried very much to shed that, her old self, her old skin, and kind of become a different Western person. She became Svetlana Boym, and then she became Susan Boym. Until she, of course, realized that the Russian identity and our past was something that was very interesting for people in Boston. For the very first meeting with Svetlana, she told me about that film, Michelangelo Antonioni, Passenger, and she told me that that was her dream, to be that girl who just like traveled and she just was going with the wind.
She very much wanted to sort of start a life as a newly invented person here in the States. And I think Kostya got in the way of that a little bit.
Our divorce happened in part because of that girl again. She felt that, that the family life was weighing her down, that she didn't have enough freedom and she didn't want responsibilities of settling in.
I kind of hid the fact I was married. I stopped wearing a ring. Honestly, sorry, Kostya. I think I felt that this 2 years from getting married to immigrating was so hard. I'm 21 when I arrived, so I'm like 23. I wanted my youth back. I really felt that I immigrated to finally go to university.
Svetlana first showed up in my office. Her Spanish was great, but there was something that just did not make sense in her biographical self-portrait. Svetlana came here as Susana, being the daughter of Spanish Republicans. So I said, okay, what's next? I was aware that it was a story that she was telling because the details were also literary. I was intrigued by the idea of somebody coming to my office lying. She asked me where my last name came from, Borinsky, and I said, well, Russia. And at that point, the connection was made. And she told me what her name was, where she came from, and how, in fact, nobody was there for her to help her out in giving her an academic home. She had all of that energy of the immigrant, of the person who has to invent the world for herself. She felt visible, and that is something remarkable, considering that she was an immigrant. There was something in her, a kind of reaching out with basic questions, almost philosophical questions about life.
The year was like 1982 or 1983. Alicia gave me 3 books. Roland Barthes, Mythologies, Michel Foucault, The Order of Things, and Jacques Derrida of Grammatology. I took them as kind of public intellectuals and philosophers, not as representatives of literary theory, American academia. These books changed my life. And I think I misunderstood them.
She was just transported because it was a very different way of thinking and writing. And so I said, but what did you get from that? You were 22 years old. You had come from the Soviet Union. You didn't have, a fundamental education in philosophy. Your understanding of Marxism was Soviet. So how did you understand what they were in dialogue with? And she said, I didn't understand what they were saying. What I understood was that they were using language and humor and the very sort of the tools of being indirect in a different way. And that opened up an entire world. It's almost like the first thing she perceived was the shadow. And then it took all her education to figure out what was a shadow of.
It was a shift to thinking that it's a more playful, self-reflective description. I think I trusted playfulness and humor more than building a system that explains everything.
She came to see me because I was involved in comparative literature, not because she had any interest in Russian literature as a field to study and for her degree. I think the reason being that she'd grown up in Leningrad and was aware of the dreary cliches that dominated official discussions of Russian literature. And when she was accepted as a graduate student, she took a seminar with me on the city and literature, a comparative seminar, and I persuaded her to do a paper on a work by Osip Mandelstam called The Egyptian Stamp. And I think it was a revelation for her. I don't think she was familiar with Russian modernism at all. She wrote an absolutely brilliant paper, which I wound up recommending that she submit for publication. And this was her first work as a graduate student. I haven't had that experience very often. What I saw in that paper, besides a first-rate intellect, was that she was a born writer. The way her mind moved from one thing to another, the muscular intellection that was going on was eye-opening, very satisfying, and deeply perceptive.
We first met when she was a graduate student. She was the head teaching fellow for my big lecture course on surrealism. She, in the meantime, finished her dissertation and then was recruited from among many applicants as an assistant professor in the comparative literature department.
Here is a woman that in the space of about 10 years went from doing a lot of work as a travel guide in St. Petersburg to a professor at Harvard, and to also being invited back to the Hermitage to consult on a project that Rem Koolhaas was doing to rethink the museum. When we both started teaching, everyone told us that there was no way we would get tenure. For women of our generation, where it was not a given.
In those days, for an assistant professor to be promoted to tenure here at Harvard, especially in the humanities, was almost impossible. And to accomplish this, she had to achieve qualitatively and quantitatively publication records, which I've never seen anyone match. By the time she came up for tenure, having only been here, I think, 6 or 7 years, she had 2 wonderful books already published, plus numerous articles. At the same time as she was writing her play, making her short film, and writing some short stories, she was just an extraordinarily energetic person. And she did this not to build resumes, but because she really loved doing it. She really wanted to do it. She really had something to say.
She was a huge reader and was a loving theory. But what she liked was to make links. She was a real comparative person. She was absolutely not dogmatic and not attached to any special kind of theory. Even if she read all what was called French theory at that time, she was making links to Russian and American and really finding her own path.
The people who interested her were the Russians who traveled, Shklovsky, Mayakovsky, Elsa Triolet, Mandelstam, Brodsky, who actually left and did not go back, people whom we can think of as being in a position of outsiderness and exile, whether actual or internal.
But she never was a cookbook critic. She always spent as much time questioning the theory as she did sort of doing her analyses. It made her a wonderful teacher because she would question her students the same way when she found them painting by the numbers.
Svetlana's seminar played on the romance of nostalgia and the feelings of loss and displacement that feed it. It allowed thinking about longing and daydreaming and allowed reflection. But at the same time, it sneaked in a reflection and a way of thinking about nostalgia as a historical and political emotion, as a treacherous feeling that allows for nationalism and a romance with a fantasy more than a reality. And it was so unexpected and so wholly different from anything else that I'd experienced in Romania or in my other classes at Harvard. And so I decided not to study political science anymore because I had found the most interesting political thinking in a literature class.
She was very good at enlisting her friends, her students, her colleagues in her projects. So she would give us chapters of her books to read, for example. We would help with some editing.
And she had a sense of humor, which was really very original to all, peculiar.
What she above all had, which maybe other exiles also have, is a kind of willingness to not take things too seriously, because you know that any minute now you might have to pack up your bags and go.
This was the era of big theory. For most people, what that meant, especially for young people, it meant reading fashionable theories, figuring out how they could be applied to a body of, say, literary texts, and then, playing out the algorithm. Svetlana approached this very differently. This was the period of the fashionable theory of the death of the author. She said, well, let's wait a minute. I remember a wonderful line from her dissertation and then from her first book, Death in Quotation Marks, where with a kind of wonderful Russian bluntness, she said, Barthes, Foucault, de Man are dead. The author is alive.
She wrote a book about the death or suicide of actual authors when everybody was talking about the fact that authors are non-existent, that there are no authors, that, that these are just invented entities. The author was out the window, and I think Svetlana, in one of her kind of brilliant moves, brings him back into the conversation through his suicide.
She was always very interested early on in the arts of the everyday, how people in communal apartments would organize little shrines, little collections of things, their apartment lives.
Her interest in memory was not about erecting monuments, but rather looking at what is left over, what's unmonumental, the smallness of things, the commonplace, the gap, the missing link, the refuse.
She sat down and looked into her own experience of growing up in Leningrad, in a communal apartment.
She really was a master at using personal voice, humanizing something which could otherwise be dry, academic, theoretical, but never excessively.
I just can't help but think that something like Common Places or The Future of Nostalgia or Another Freedom are not the books in some ways about herself. Some of them very frankly so, right? There are all these personal asides and personal anecdotes and close reading personal experience. It's so hard to separate the personal from the political, from the creative, from the scholarly. Maybe in some ways these books belong on the bookshelf, definitely of scholarship, but also of creative literature by other emigres. She could, in a very refreshing way, think from far away. She was the most interesting example of this attempt to square Russia and America.
We've been apart for 6.5 years, and finally we've been on the list of Ted Kennedy. So we've been one of the first in 1987 who got permission. We came together with mother-in-law who dreamed to see Svetlana. They love each other. When she came to meet us in the airport, it was very moving, very touching.
Nostalgia has to do with collective memory, with relationship between collective homeland and personal home. The word has two roots, nostos meaning return home, and alge meaning longing. I define it as a longing for home that no longer exists, or perhaps has never existed. For me, it's a sort of a sentiment of loss and displacement, and at the same time a romance with one's own fantasy. I think nostalgia and modernity are like Jekyll and Hyde, part and parcel, are interconnected because nostalgia emerges as a distinctly modern disease, a reaction to modern experience of time. And nostalgia is often perceived as longing for home, longing for space, but it's really longing for another time or different rhythm of time. Our contemporary culture does not allow us to take time or to make time for thinking. So nostalgia is a kind of a rebellion against the sort of modern conception of progress. For me, nostalgia is not only retrospective, but also prospective, and we make sense of the past for the future, and sometimes we go sideways. It's also always a confrontation with one's mortality and a desire for immortality.
Nostalgia is a kind of illness. It's a kind of, from my point of view, it's a kind of masochistic, self-destructive impulse. Normal nostalgia about childhood, which everybody, I believe, experiences it, mix in our case with totalitarian environment. It's a very dangerous cocktail.
I distinguish between restorative nostalgia, that's based on nostos, restoration of this collective home. When one is nostalgic for one's childhood and domesticates the political, paints it with rosy hues. And reflective nostalgia, based on longing, it's a reflection on time and memory. So that reflective nostalgia is really, really crucial because it's a kind of counterpoint to this narrative of progress, fascination with technology. Having lived half of my life in the westmost point of Russia and the other half on the eastern edge of the United States, I consider myself bi-coastal this way. I am forever haunted by the specter of two warring queens, the Mother Russia and the Statue of Liberty. Through my research, I learned that the experience of freedom has never been valued equally throughout the history and across cultures. I don't think of freedom as something sovereign or autonomous. I don't think of freedom as an effect of free market or of cunning reason or of history. Freedom really involves human agency and the element of the unpredictability.
She was going back to Russia every summer for several years in a row. But the moment sort of Putin came on the scene and the whole thing just kind of solidified, Stalinized, if you will, and she no longer had any sort of interest in that.
Arts of freedom are arts. There are no rules for them. But as in theater, you work with conventions, with rules, but not always by the rules.
I think Svetlana has some relation with contemporary Moscow conceptual art as well, and even world conceptual art.
So this is one of my images. It is a snapshot from Sarajevo after the siege. It's one of the ruined or shelled buildings that's already inhabited. By chance, I dropped a dandelion on a snapshot and took a picture. So I preserved all the impurities of the image, the glare, the cracks. It suggests an explosion and the blossoming, the destruction and the recreation.
We took reality as a sculptor taking clay and can change it, and nobody knows what is real finally. And that's also important concept of the Svetlana Boym works. Sometimes you see and you don't understand it's reality or a reflection of reality, depiction of depiction. It's very meta art in some way.
This is also my other epigraph about history in reference to the avant-garde. So this might resemble a black square of Malevich, but it's not. It's actually photographs from a book by the English historian, and they are erased faces from the Stalinist archives. So the black square and the uses of photomontage is not artistic. These people were executed. So I'm doing something very, very minimal, again photographing against the grain, just a simple act of turning the page.
I think it's also about something which exists ephemerically on the half position of disappearance and appearance, unfinished work of art or ruined works of art. It's transitional images, transitional concepts, or transition between two different concepts. She was a transitional person in some way.
I'm also fascinated with the alternative history of cinema, and I work with the idea of phantasmagoria. Originally, phantasmagoria means public gathering of ghosts. So I did a series of phantasmagorias, of histories of what if. These are images where I photograph images of political protests that happened at certain moments of history where history could have turned otherwise but didn't.
Shklovsky, in his book Knight's Gambit, what he's suggesting is that of all the pieces, the knight is the one who moves in two directions in a single move. That must have appealed to her enormously. I think she spent a lot of her career just working that out.
I'm very interested in this whole idea of the knight in the game of chess because it's a way of kind of cheating on the straight narrative of progress. It's a way of exploring third routes, zigzags, spirals, diagonals, and potentialities. Shklovsky has also interestingly said that the road of zigzag is not a road of compromise, but in fact it's the road of the brave.
She also had this theory. I mean, it's not actually unique to her, but I think she believed it a little bit that when you immigrated, your pre-immigration self continued to exist. That life went on its own track, but you didn't have access to it. She was also trying to imagine what those other lives could have been.
I'm very interested in what I would call histories of what if. Now I can lead not only parallel lives, but triple and quadruple lives.
The verbs, when you talk about her, need to be used in the plural. You've got to say Svetlana were, because there were multiple Svetlanas. She took great pleasure, as I gather, in exploring alternative identities with alternative email addresses, alternative names, and so on.
She had an email account under Olga Carr. Ilana Goldberg was her Jewish alter ego. And then there was Claudia Cardinale, which she used literally on dating websites.
We all know that being a polyglot is a must ball.
In Moscow tradition of Moscow conceptual art, it was quite popular. Had the idea of creation of personage or kind of mask of yourself on another name.
Considering the number of forms she worked with, visual, tactile, scholarly, fictional, considering that whole variety, she had to be, more than most people, a different person, a different source of the writing in each case with each project.
All life stories, and especially all stories of exiles, are always involved at least a little bit with proving that the path taken was the right path.
Instead of fast-changing propositions post-anti-neo-trans and sub that suggest an implacable movement forward against or beyond and try to be desperately in, I propose to go off as an off-quilter, off-Broadway, off the path, way off-brand, and occasionally off-color.
Svetlana was working on the idea of the off-modern for an extended period, at least 10 or 15 years. As the book has developed, it really proved to be a kind of a synthesis of her life as a scholar and her life as an artist. It's both a reflection of her own artistic practice in photography and also a lot of engagement with different creative figures, architects, museum curators, artists, and really trying to think about modernity in a fresh way. And her interest is thinking on a broad term about the 20th century in a kind of modernity that's not a mainstream Western European modernity, but it's also not particularly involved with debates on centers and peripheries, but a kind of off-ness.
And try to gather the big picture from what is in a sense a lateral move and looking at sites that are not central. I mean, the interest in the detritus is it derived from Baudelaire and certainly from Benjamin.
And she was really trying to think about modernity and in a very personal way, as a kind of diasporic, emigre type experience.
The off-modern, for example, is all about errors, paths that alternative paths in science, in technology, in thought, that were attempted, erroneously arrived at, and not taken, which she thinks are the places where kind of, glimmers of redemption can be found.
She was fascinated with things that were unintentional, I think. Like she was fascinated with broken technology.
So once I ran out of black cartridge, it was a very old computer which still had a black cartridge, so I had to hit it, and a kind of psychedelic unconsciousness began to spill out. The era has an aura.
The off-modern is partly, I think, a polemic against simple periodizations, in which you had the modern and then you had the post-modern. And in particular, it's a polemic in favor of an engagement with history against postmodernist pastiche. And that the off-modern for her means a real engagement, as she likes to use the phrase, an estrangement for the world, not an estrangement from the world. So it's a kind of an off politics that's neither a party line nor disengaged politically.
She had an enormous role in my life. Early in our friendship, she declared her childhood and adolescence always felt very, very isolated. She really searched to have that kind of proximity of minds.
In our friendship, we pretty much told each other everything, I think. We had one of those friendships where she definitely knew more about my intimate relationships and everything connected with them than anyone else in the world. And I think I was pretty much kept abreast as well.
She had ups and downs, Svetlana. She wanted to have a child, and I assume that if one wants to have a child and one can't have a child, there is a sense of loss.
What did Svetlana most enjoy? She loves Italian movies from the 50s, Antonioni and all that. Anything in visual art virtually, as long as it was new. And then music she loved, but she didn't like anything romantic. She loved sort of Bach-like things. Her sort of omnivorous interests and openness to new experience and to new visual culture and also to politics. I had never met anybody in my life who had that capacity.
She had invited me, and following me, a good friend of mine, to be her Jewish family, where your presence is always absolutely and without any limitation reliable. Our Hebrew lessons were a way of celebrating that kind of familyness.
Later, Svetlana was more connected to Jewish culture. She went to Israel a few times. And I think that Svetlana didn't belong to any territories. She belongs to literature. It's a very Jewish meaning.
Her search for a post-Soviet identity culminated with her trips to Israel. Tel Aviv is really a city that was created as a secular socialist fantasy of a certain kind of a Jewish communal living. It's become like a kind of a celebration of the creative being in the world of the kind Svetlana always loved. The Soviet authorities had referred to Jewishness in the 30s as cosmopolitanism, and this is one of the reasons her babushka, her grandmother, was arrested and sent to the Gulag. I think she tried to refashion this cosmopolitanism as a Jewish identity, a positive one that was not defined by discrimination and exclusion, but one that was an identity to embrace and to practice.
And she was making that film about Vienna. This is this gap in collective memory about the Soviet Jews who were spending some number of months in Vienna in transit, and she was really starting to figure out why that may have been, in terms of her own memory, but also in terms of collective political imagination.
I began my research in various archives and soon discovered that the break in my personal memory went together with a blind spot in collective history. As I wandered through the camp territory, no new reminiscence came to me. I had no new memory about our immigration. Yet photographing the camp was strangely ecstatic. It felt like quenching an old thirst. Everything I photographed all over the world was there. Wandering through the remains of the camp, I suddenly discovered the landscape of my own photographs. The camp walls migrated with me from one continent to another. They were a part of my emotional geography. Unmemorable, the camp became a hidden backdrop of my second home and of my art.
The way she went through her disease was just truly heroic. There was a whole Russian thing going on, which is you don't really talk about things, you don't expose things, you don't make people know about things. She just soldiered on. She continued writing. In that last document she produced in the hospital, she says, when does I stop being I? I mean, at what point is the disease such that you are no longer the person that you are? My wakeful hours are hard and painful, but in my dreams, I'm just like living that life, the life of fantasy that she made possible in her writing. And I think that's something that really kept her going all during these months. I mean, it was a very short period of time. She was diagnosed in January and she died in August.